Good morning, class. Mr. Manta here, and this is today's video lesson for Thursday, March 26th, 2020. Hopefully you can hear me clearly and alright. A few students on the last video said that it was a little bit quiet. They couldn't hear me that loud, so I tried to turn up the gain, so you should hear my voice a little bit louder than usual. And we're going to go ahead and jump into it. Our topic for today is going to be vision. In other words, how do we see? How do our eyes work? How do we make sense of the world? It's also going to feature what may be the very coolest possible demonstration that I could do through a video lesson. It's going to involve you guys learning, whether you know this or not, that each of you are partially blind. It's really cool. We'll get to it at the end. I'll explain what's going on when we get there. Alright, first things first, today is going to feature a do now. There's going to be, I want to say, 9 different questions, so go ahead and take out your science notebooks and number them 1 through 9. For question 1, you're going to need a little bit of space, but the other ones you're just going to need to write one word a pop. So go ahead and write it numbers 1 through 9, and I'll just click through these slides. Pause the video and go ahead and get started answering numbers 1 and 2 now. Alright, you're going to get moving on from there. Here are numbers 3 through 6. Answer these now. And moving on once more to our final slide, these are numbers 7 through 9. Pause the video, answer them now. Alright, hopefully you got your answers written out in your notebook. You can check now if they are correct, if you are on the right page, if you're where you're at for where you need to be for the quiz that we have coming up on Tuesday. Question 1. Name 2 ways that light in an orange laser beam is different from the light in a blue laser beam. There's 2 main ones that should come to mind. First of all, an orange laser will have a longer wavelength than a blue laser. It's because orange light, the difference between different colors of light is their wavelength. So the orange light is more stretched out like that, whereas the blue light is more bunched together like that. Second of all, an orange laser has less energy. That's because the longer your wavelength is, the less energy you have. So more energy in the blue laser, less energy in the orange. That should have been your number 1 and 2. Those are the 2 key differences. Number 2 is asking you to fill in blanks A, B, and C on the diagram with types of non-visible light. This is what you should have gotten. This is our spectrum of light, going all the way down from the radio waves up to the gamma rays. We learned that the visible spectrum, all the colors of the rainbow, fall right in here, and to each side of it we have different kinds of non-visible light. The ones that were missing were right here, infrared light. That's longer than red, but shorter than, so longer than red light, but shorter than radio waves. We were missing over here X-rays, which are longer than ultraviolet. And over here we were missing gamma rays, which are, I'm sorry, I should have said X-rays are shorter than ultraviolet, and gamma rays are the shortest, see over here, the shortest wavelengths of all, whereas radio waves are the very longest. You should be able to fill in this whole diagram of all the different types of non-visible light, even if I don't give you any of them. So if you couldn't finish those 3 today, then this diagram is definitely something that you are going to need to study. Alright, questions 3 through 5. We're talking about reflection and absorption from the last lesson. What color or colors of light reflect off of a yellow banana? Yellow light. You have some yellow light that streams in here. If any yellow light hits these bananas, it will bounce back out, and that is why they look yellow to you. Off of a green frog would be green light. Things always reflect light of their same color. If any green light came streaming in here, it would bounce off the frog and come out here. That's why you would see him as green. What color or colors of light reflect off of a white snowball? All colors of light. We learned that white light is made up of all the other colors, and so any different color of the rainbow that could come in off the snowball would come bouncing right back off, and that is why it looks white, because it reflects all the colors together. And what color or colors of light reflect off of a black shoe? None of them. That's why it looks black, because any light, no matter what color it is that comes in and hits the shoe, just gets absorbed and stays right there, and that's why it looks dark. It's not reflecting any light. Hopefully you got 4 out of 4 there. Our final set of answers, we're learning about these words transparent, opaque, and translucent. How would we describe some sheer curtains? Well, they let some light through, but not all of the light, so those curtains are translucent. That means that some light passes through. For number 8, the glass bowl, that would be transparent, because we can see pretty clearly that all light can pass straight through. And for number 9, the winter coat, we would call that opaque, because no light can pass through. It just hits the coat and gets absorbed or reflected right there. So we had translucent, transparent, and opaque. Hopefully you got 3 out of 3 there. Your first classwork question for today is real simple. Just go onto the classwork and answer me how many out of the 9 did you get correct on today's Do Now. Go ahead, pause the video, answer that 1 through 9 now. I'm going to keep it moving, bringing it back, and moving into today's lesson. So, in this picture, we're looking at a very colorful room. Somewhere in somebody's home, I would guess. Now, we've learned from all these lessons we've had on light, and this is our last new lesson today, the last bit of new information, that in this room, we have light bouncing all over the place. We have all kinds of white light streaming in from the windows, with all different colors, all different wavelengths going on inside of it. We have all these different objects that are reflecting light, so our blue cushion down here is reflecting blue light. This red stool over here is reflecting red light. The orange couch is reflecting orange. So basically we're at the point now where we understand that we have a room with waves of light bouncing like crazy all over the place. Our question today is going to be, with all of that light that's bouncing all over the place, how do our eyes actually go about seeing it? When you are, the way that your eyes work, when you're looking at something, what you're actually seeing is the light that's coming off of it. And today we're going to learn about exactly how that happens, so that you can actually look at a room like this and see it and have it make some amount of sense what it is that you're looking at. Today's focus question is the very simple question, well, really it turns out to be pretty complex: how do you see? Or at least that was going to be the focus question. I hesitate because I know I have some very smart alecky students who would give me a silly answer like, I see with my eyes, duh, be very goofy about it. I'm thinking of, who would say that in Purdue? Probably Aberdeen. In UT, it would probably be like Quincy or Matthew. And in Georgia Tech, it would probably be, I would feel like Jihad would give me an answer like this. I see with my eyes. So we're not going to have that be our focus question. A better focus question would be this: how does the human eye see? I'm going to learn about how vision and light actually work together. In order to do that, first we're going to start talking, we're going to learn about how a camera works, actually, because the way a camera works is really similar to how your eye works, but it's actually a little bit simpler inside of a camera. So we're going to start here talking about cameras, and then we're going to end up talking about the human eye and how it is that the human eye works. Turns out pretty similar to how cameras work. So let's think about the parts of a camera. Now, in this example, I'm looking at what's called a DSLR camera. That means like a full-on regular camera that takes really nice pictures. This is the same parts that I'm going to show you here are also found in like the camera in your phone or tablet. All cameras kind of work off the same basic technology. First of all, one thing that you notice on a camera is that up front it has a lens. In this picture I have the lens circled right here. This is kind of like a top-down view of a camera so that we can kind of see what's going on inside of it. And so the lens is this piece of glass up front. And the lens's job is just to be a piece of glass that light passes through, and light kind of gets focused. When you change the focus on a camera, it changes the lens. But basically, light just passes through the lens. That's why it's clear. After the lens, there's a very important part in a camera called an aperture. An aperture, you can see clearly if you look here in the top-down view, an aperture is actually a hole. It's like a space. It's this little empty space, this gap that's in between the different parts of the camera, right in the middle right here. Or if you look on this picture, in the very, very center, that little guy, the hole in the center, is your aperture. And it's actually an empty hole. The reason why it's a hole is so that light can pass through and narrow down the amount of light that is able to pass through a camera, right? So if we imagine that this camera is sitting in a room, in this room there's all kinds of light waves that are bouncing all over the place. Well, the only light that will get into the camera will be light that happens to pass through the lens and make it through this little hole called the aperture. The aperture can shrink smaller, or it can push back and grow larger in order to change the amount of light that comes through. After the aperture, we also have this thing in the back of the camera. So now that light has passed through the lens, it's passed through the aperture, it hits this thing on the back of a camera called the image sensor. You can't really see it in this picture because it's like back inside the depths of the camera, but in the top-down picture over here, you can see it in the back here. The image sensor is in a digital camera, and basically it's like this really fancy bit of technology where any light wave that passes through and hits the image sensor, it has a whole bunch of little cells, like little tiny sensors on it, and each of those can detect what color of light is hitting it and knows to recreate a picture with all of those same colors of light on it. Back in the old days when cameras used film, this instead would have been a piece of film. In the new digital cameras that we mostly use today, this is instead like a digital image sensor. And then the very last part is that all of that information from the image sensor gets passed through a little wire to a little bit of a computer chip that's called an image processor, where it takes all these different cells that were lit up with different colors of light, and it makes sense of them. It kind of like does a whole bunch of calculations, and it figures out what exactly the camera is looking at. And when everything is said and done, you end up, are we able to show it in a second? Oh, we'll get to that part in a minute. You end up being able to see a picture. All right, so just to review real quick the parts that we talked about, we have the lens up here, the aperture is this empty space, the image sensor where the picture actually gets detected, and then the image processor where the picture kind of gets put together and made into a coherent picture. Here is classroom question 2. What is the aperture in a camera? Pause the video and answer it either in your notebook or on the Google form now. Bringing it back from there. So now that we've seen all the different parts of the camera, we're going to get a really clear walkthrough of how the camera actually works, what's going on when the camera takes a picture. So we're going to imagine that we're looking at our camera from the top down, and we're trying to take a picture of that room that we saw earlier, which you can see is now facing our camera. Well, since there's light reflecting all over the place in this room, we know that there's certain colors of light that are reflecting off of certain objects. So for example, I can see that this back wall in the room is mostly blue with the windows kind of in between it, but all this blue space here, well, that's reflecting blue light. There's blue-white light waves reflecting off of that all the time because it's the color blue. So some of those blue light waves would reflect off of the wall, they would pass through the lens, they would pass through the aperture, and they would hit this image sensor and tell the image sensor, certain cells on it, to turn the color blue. There's a whole bunch of other stuff though that's also in the room. So for example, we see that there is that orange couch in the middle of the room. So that couch would be reflecting off orange light. That would pass through the lens, through the aperture, and hit the image sensor as well. We had the green plant that was in the room, so there's green waves of light bouncing off the green plant. They're going to go through and hit the image sensor. We had that red stool. Those red waves are going to come off and hit the image sensor. And heck, we also have these windows in the back that are letting in a whole bunch of white light that has all the colors in it. So there's a lot of light waves. There's all these different colored waves making up white light that are also coming and passing through our camera's lens, aperture, and hitting the image sensor. The image sensor then relays all of those different cells that are telling it what colors of light waves it's seeing back to our image processor, and the image processor turns all this information here into an actual picture that you can look at. And maybe you can frame it and put it on your wall. So that is the basic idea of how a camera works. All this stuff in the room is reflecting, bouncing off different colors of light. They pass through the camera lens onto the camera sensor, and it turns it into a picture. It's a really wonderful piece of technology. It's why it's taken a lot of time, millions of years, for people to invent cameras. Alright, now that we know how a camera works, we can kind of compare that to the way that a human eye works, because the parts are basically the same for the most part. First of all, one thing that you probably know about your eyes, that you've probably seen about people's eyes, it has this part here, the colored part that we call the iris. The iris that's the part that's colored, so if you have blue eyes, it's because your iris is blue. If you have brown eyes, it's because your iris is brown. The iris is actually kind of like a little muscle, and what's cool about it is that it can change its shape, so it can shrink down to make the pupil in the center really small, or it can expand to make the pupil kind of bigger, and it does that based on like how bright the room that you're in is, so that it can open and close and let in different amounts of light. The pupil, which is the black spot in the middle of somebody's eye, is actually just like a hole. Like if you could reach in through somebody's eye and poke through it, you could poke straight through the pupil. It's just a little hole, a little bit of empty space. On this diagram of the eye, you can kind of see inside of it. And again, the pupil is just this little gap, a little empty space in the eye itself. So together, the iris and the pupil are kind of like the aperture of a camera. They're like this little space that opens and closes and lets in light waves that are bouncing around to enter the eye through the pupil, because the pupil is just a hole. There also is in your eye, much like a camera, a lens, but it's a little bit different because the lens in your eye is actually behind the pupil, whereas the lens in a camera is like up in front of the aperture and all that. But there is a lens that focuses the light so that you can see clearly. And then in the back, there is this thing called the retina. That's maybe the most important part for you to learn today. It's hard to exactly see on this image, but basically the whole back wall of your eye is what people refer to as the retina. Your eye is kind of like an empty space. It's mostly filled with this clear gel, but all along the back wall is this thing called the retina. The retina in your eyeball is basically like that image sensor that we saw, if I rewind, to the camera. So this thing here that's picking up all the colors of light that are hitting it is just the same thing as this thing in the back of your eye that picks up light and can detect different colors and different amounts of light. The last question is, well, in our camera we had this thing called the image processor up here that was like a little computer that could take all that information and put it together so that you can actually see something. Well, where is the image processor in your eye? It's a good question, because in fact your eye doesn't have an image processor like a camera does. In this case, the image processor is your brain, up here. Your eyeball, when the retina detects all these different colors that are hitting it, sends all that information down this, it's kind of like a wire that's in your brain. It's really a giant nerve called the optic nerve. All that information goes through the optic nerve, and then your brain has the job of putting together all these different nerve signals, basically, into a coherent image and figuring out what exactly it is that you're looking at. So we don't have an image processor in our eye. Your brain does the image processing. Pause the video. Classroom question 3, in your own words, what does the retina in our eyes do? Pause the video and answer that in your notebook or on the Google form now. And bringing it back. Alright, so just like we saw a demonstration of how a camera works, we're going to see a demonstration of how your eyes work. In this case, it's not a camera that's looking at our room here, it's just a regular person's eye. But it's the exact same thing that happens. We have this room over here that's reflecting light in all different ways from all these different colored objects. Well, some of that light is getting reflected through and into this person's eye. All the different colors from all the different colored objects in the room. That light passes through the pupil, it goes through the eye and hits this thing called the retina in the back, where all these different cells detect the colors that are hitting them, and then they send that information up to the brain. And the brain takes all that information and assembles it into the actual thing that you're seeing, this room. It's because of this light bouncing around, passing through the eye, and getting processed by the brain that you are able to see, that your brain kind of puts together this image of the room that you're looking at. Or, in theory, if you look around wherever you're sitting right now, your brain and your eyes are actively doing this. They're taking in light, and they're assembling the field of view or the field of vision that you have of the space that's around you. It's really cool. This is going just a little bit more in depth, just because I think it's kind of cool to zoom in, but we're kind of going into the extra credit question territory here. If you could zoom into the retina, this part of the back of your eye that actually detects all the light going on, what you would see is that there's a whole bunch of these tiny little cells, these little individual sensors that have the job of actually detecting the light that's hitting them. There's two main kinds of sensors, and the doctors who study eyes or who work on eyes call them cones and rods. Each of them has a different job. So like one of them detects really dim, faint light, and one of them detects really bright light. One of them works more with black and white, and one of them works more with color. And you're going to read a little bit more about that in the independent reading that you guys have today after this video lesson wraps up. It's just kind of cool to see in more detail. And amazingly, some scientists have been able to use super powerful microscopes and zoom in super close on the back of somebody's eyeball, and you can actually see all these little cells called rods and cones that are able to detect the kind of light that's hitting them. Then they light up and they send that signal back to the brain to actually make sense of what they're looking at. It's pretty cool what we can do with microscopes these days. Alright, this part, folks, is the most exciting part of the lesson for today. We're going to do a demonstration that, if it works correctly, should blow your mind. Should be like sincerely awesome. When I did this for the very first time, I freaked out because I learned that I was partially blind. In fact, everybody is partially blind. Why? Well, because if we look back at this diagram that we just saw of the human eyeball, one thing that you might notice is the things that, like your ability to see things, comes from all these little cells that are in the back of your retina, picking up the light waves that are hitting them. And so anywhere where you have cells, you're able to detect the light that you are seeing. But right here in the diagram, and this part's really important, this is where that cable, that kind of like that wire almost called the optic nerve, comes through, and it has to somehow get out of the back of the eyeball and out into the brain. And so right here on the retina, like there's sensors and sensors and sensors all over here, but right here there are no light sensors, no rods and cones in your retina. So you have a little spot in your vision where you are actually totally blind. You normally don't notice it because your brain is really good at just making up whatever it wants you to see in that spot. But if we mess with your brain, we can actually prove this. Here's the demonstration. Probably doesn't look like much right now, but this is about to blow your mind. Here's how it works. First thing that I want you to do is take your hand and cover it over your left eye so that you cannot see out of your left eye, and now you can only see out of your right eye. What I want you to do then is take your right eye and look square at the X that you are seeing on the screen here. Focus really hard, only looking at that X. What you're going to do next is, it depends on like the size of the screen that you're using, but basically you're going to move your head or the screen like closer together and farther apart. You'll get to a certain point, like for me, if I look at my computer and I pull my head maybe 2 feet away from my computer screen, you get to a point where the circle on the other side of the screen completely disappears. It's still there on the screen in reality, but you can't see it because it's in your blind spot. So for me on my computer, when I have this full screen, I have to put my head about 2 feet away from my screen. I tested it earlier. If you're using like a phone or a tablet, something small, you probably have to have your head maybe 8 inches or 1 foot away from the screen. But you should be covering your left eye with your hand and looking at this X with your right eye. If you can't get it to work, kind of move your head back and forth closer and farther away from the screen until eventually the circle will disappear. Once you've completed that, you can also try it the other way around. Cover your right eye with your hand so that you're only looking out of your left eye, and look at the circle now with your left eye. If you move your head back and forth towards and away from the screen, you'll eventually zoom out to a point where the X completely disappears. Mr. Manta is not messing with the video. I'm not doing anything. That X or that circle is literally disappearing because you have a blind spot in your eye. And if you close the other eye and you position the circle or the X so that it's in your eye's blind spot, you can't see it. And your brain just fills in that space with the color that's around it, this kind of generic gray color. I find that super cool. Hopefully it worked for you too. I do want to check to see if this actually worked. So the fourth classroom question, you can pause this video and just look at the screen and try to get the demonstration to work for you, moving your head back and forth. After you've done that and you've gotten it to work, the fourth classroom question, I just want you to tell me, were you able to get the blind spot demonstration to work properly? It works properly if you got the circle or the X to disappear by covering one eye and looking at the other one. I think that's really cool. Alright, today's been another lesson with a whole bunch of information, and so some of you are probably thinking again, Mr. Manta, how much of this do I really have to know? All this stuff about the different parts of the eye and all that. Here's today's key points, and this is what you are responsible for knowing for quizzes and exit tickets and do-nows in the future. First of all, your eye works in a similar way to how a camera works. Light waves enter through a hole in the front for your eye, that's the pupil, and are picked up by sensors in the back. It's only because light is bouncing all over the place that we're able to see anything, because some of that light enters through that hole in our eye and is picked up. Second of all, there are 4 key parts of the human eye. That's the iris, the pupil, the lens, and the retina. In reality, sure, there are more parts of the eye than that, but those are the 4 that Mr. Manta wants you to know. You should know what each of those actually means. Third of all, your brain acts as the image processor, quote unquote, for the information from your retina. So you can only see because your eyeballs and your brain are working together, and your eyeballs send information up to your brain to actually be processed and turned into an image. That's what you needed to take away from today's lesson. Alright, that's all we had for today, folks. That was our last lesson of new material before our quiz on Tuesday. So anything we've learned since we've been remote learning is stuff that you're responsible for know that could show up on that quiz. For today, we're going to go ahead and move to exit ticket time. Yes, there is independent work. It's really short, I promise. And I want to point out also today's cool thing. It's a YouTube video that you can search called Why We Have Blind Spots and How to See the Blood Vessels Inside Your Own Eye. If you thought that blind spot thing we did a second ago was really cool, this video goes even more in depth about how your eyeball works and goes and adds on like a bonus demonstration that's a little bit harder to make it work, but allows you to see the blood vessels inside of your own eyeballs. Check it out if you're curious. Your independent work for today, let me show you really quickly, looks, if you come to vision reading, oh, it should say vision independent reading, I'll have to fix that, and click the link. The independent reading should look like this for today. Alright, that's all we got. Knock out your exit tickets, your classwork, and your independent, and I will see you on Monday. No science tomorrow. Good news for all you guys. No new science material. Review the stuff we've been doing so far. Have a nice weekend. So long.